let's continue on as this starts to cool. So what can you do with harvested beeswax? Well, you want to melt it down, like I said, to separate it from the rest of the stuff that's stuck to it. So in this picture here, you will notice that my friend and bee club member Jake is pouring some beeswax onto the top of our solar wax melter. And a solar wax melter is just that. It melts the wax using the heat and the light from the sun. And so it's made in a couple of different layers, but what he's doing is he's setting the beeswax onto the top portion, which is hardware cloth, like a screening material that's metal. And below it is a metal pan that's slanted, and at the bottom of that slant is a bread pan. So you can think through that the wax is going to melt through, go down that metal pan into the bread pan. And you'll see in this next photo a little bit closer, that's him putting some of the beeswax chunks that we've collected. A lot of that is mostly burr comb, and we're scraping it onto the hardware cloth, which is kind of hard to see because it's screening, so it's see-through, but there it is on the very top of that framing there. We just stapled it with a staple gun. And then here you can see he's put the lid on. A lot of beekeepers make solar wax melters themselves. You don't need to purchase one. And I'll say that a lot throughout a lot of beekeeping presentations, that there's a lot of things you simply do not need to buy. You can make them at home. One of the easiest and most inexpensive ways to make a solar wax melter of your own is to take an old cooler, so like an igloo cooler, take a stock pot like this that you don't particularly care for, put it inside the cooler, put all your beeswax in it, and then get a piece of plexiglass on top, and the sun will melt all of that beeswax in there nice and slowly, and then you can take that beeswax and filter it, which we'll talk about in a second. But this is one that we bought from a supplier called Man Lake, M-A-N-N-L-A-K-E, Man Lake. They're a retailer that sells stuff nationally, and they have a website, and you can buy things online. So I waited until it went on sale, but you can buy these at other local places as well. So he put the lid on it, and you can use plexiglass or something similar, but this is a plastic screen that has some UV protection, but it allows the sun to come through, and it'll generate a lot of heat. Inside of that box, especially because we painted it black on the outside, it'll get upwards of about 150 degrees or more on a nice hot sunny day. And on the roof of the student union, you can imagine how hot it gets up there. It's always 10 degrees hotter up there than it is down in the grass. And so that's the perfect day to have your solar wax melter out, and it will not take more than an hour or two for that to melt through on a hot sunny day. So that heat will slowly and gently melt it. The melting point of wax is just under 150 degrees, and that's when it becomes a liquid. And then you can see that it's melted, it's hit that slanted metal pan, and it has slowly dripped into the bread pan that's at the bottom. And you can see how liquid that beeswax is. It's really, really hot. And so you have to be careful as you're pulling it out to not spill it or make a mess. But it's really, really hot. And so from there, what we do is we allow it to cool, and it'll form a brick like this. Now, much like the chicken noodle soup that you put in your fridge, a thin layer of fat will form on the top. It's a lipid, but then the soup underneath is still going to be soup and broth. It's exactly what's going to happen here. You're going to have a layer of wax on top and honey underneath. So it'll congeal, and it'll form a solid brick that's slightly smaller than the container as it cools, and you can pop it out pretty easily with some wiggling, and you'll notice there's a lot of honey there in the bottom. And you can heat that honey up, filter it like you would if you were harvesting honey, and jar it up and eat it. It's perfectly good. So it's not something to throw away, but there will be honey and some residue on the bottom, so that's why you want to filter it. And that residue, that gunk that you can kind of see in this last picture, is scientifically known as slum gum. I don't know who came up with that term, but I've read it in scientific journals. They call it slum gum. It's just the term that refers to all the gunk that you don't want in your beeswax and in your honey. So it turns into a solid brick, and then what you can do is you can break it up. Here's another brick that's might have been the one from that pan. So a nice thick brick of beeswax. And then what you want to do is you want to break it up, melt it in a double boiler much like this, and filter it. Because filtering it through just that hardware cloth is not enough. The hardware cloth will catch a lot of the larger pieces of gunk like actual bees and leaves or anything else that may have gotten into your wax container, but it won't filter out little particles. So that's what we want to do with the filtering process here. So putting some beeswax into a double boiler and just like this, slowly bringing it up to a boil, and that beeswax will slowly melt. You'll see here it started to melt a little bit. And you'll notice here I'm actually using a Pyrex container that's a lot smaller than this, and that's okay. You just want to make sure that it fits inside the larger container and that water can get around it to heat up the Pyrex jar or the Pyrex bowl. And over time it'll continue to get thinner and thinner until it's almost all liquid. And once it gets to just past this point where it's totally liquid, you can filter it. Can anyone guess what I'm going to use to filter it with? Pantyhose. The same thing that I use to filter the honey. Pantyhose, I don't think I actually use pantyhose for the purpose of pantyhose. I basically use it for everything other than what it was originally intended for, but it's so good for so many different uses. Filtering honey and filtering beeswax are two of those things that it's really helpful with. So what we do is we stretch some pantyhose over the top of a cup that you don't like, and hopefully a cup that you can tear apart, and a cup that can handle heat. So you want to use a cup that can be something you would maybe serve coffee in. So a to-go coffee cup or a paper cup or a styrofoam cup. I like to use cups like that that can tear so that when it hardens in the bottom, if you can't wiggle it out, you could tear the cup apart. So you wouldn't want to put it in a coffee mug or something that would be hard to get it out of. So stretching that pantyhose over the top of it, and then you pour in the liquid and then let it filter through. And then what I've done here is it's kind of mostly filtered through, so I took the sides up and I'm just holding it up to allow the weight to let the rest of that pull through. And then when you look at your pantyhose afterwards, there's some more slum gum, that silly slum gum that's in the pantyhose that you can throw away. And then you're left with some beautiful clean beeswax that you can use for projects like the one we're making today. So this has started to cool a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and, oops, that's all right. That's why we toss these. So I'm going to go ahead and pour in the rest of the ingredients. And actually now I'm going to start using a rubber spatula because that'll allow me to, as it starts to cool, to scrape it around a little bit easier. So I'm going to move it over here. And I believe the recipe, which is in this book, I'll talk about in a second, but this is my favorite beeswax crafting book. It calls for how many drops of the essential oil? It calls for 15 to 20 drops, which means I'm going to do 20 because I like it to be very scented. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the essential oil and pour the drops in. And every essential oil has kind of a different nozzle on the end, so you want to start slow so you don't over pour. But I'm going to put 20 drops in and stir at the same time. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Okay. And you can smell it, and you might start smelling it because that is really strong. So I'm going to continue to stir that as I add in my vitamin E, and it calls for, I think, a half of a teaspoon of vitamin E is what it calls for. So I'll add that in, half of a teaspoon of vitamin E. So, and I'm just going to eyeball that because it's a smaller amount. So I'm going to add that in, if you looked really close, or when you try this at home, you'll notice that when you pour a cool ingredient in, it starts to really cool off the spot that it hits. So stirring it will allow it to mix better. So I'm just going to kind of keep stirring this, and you'll start to notice that this will start to turn an opaque color, and it'll cool off to a point that you can actually touch it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour a couple of jars of it so that it'll cool quicker in a smaller container. And I'm going to do that over the top of this cardboard here so that if I spill that it hardens on that and not the counter. So I'll just pour a little bit there and a little bit here. And then I'm probably just going to leave the rest in this container, and then I'll reheat it at home and pour it into a container that I might give as a gift. And I don't have any of those with me today, but there's a lot of companies that sell containers of all sorts of sizes. So they'll sell different containers like this, honey jars, stuff for lip balms. You can all get this stuff online. And a website that we have found with the Boise State Bee team that we've found good prices on is SKS, just the letters SKS bottles. So just look up SKS bottles in Google and you'll find their website. But they sell containers of all shapes and sizes for all sorts of different things. So you can find the size and the color and whether or not you want glass or plastic, and then you can find the container that you would like to give these as gifts or just have around at home. So this will start to cool, and then I'll allow you guys to pass it around and smell it and try it out.